Hello everyone, this is Michael Woodburn. This is my final project for Advanced Deep Learning, CSCI E104. This is the 15-minute demonstration of the code, and I'm just going to take you through my Jupyter notebook and describe how I implemented this project. So the actual topic given to me was neural network for disease detection, and the app I've created is a chatbot that is specifically designed to be used by patients who are in the waiting room of the emergency department to help them organise their medical history and help them get information down, which can then be used by the medical treating team when they're seen. I wrote the chatbot and then I managed to deploy it online. You can find it at the URLs on this page here. And you can find it on the URLs at the end of the PowerPoint, at the beginning of the summary, and in the description of this YouTube video. So anyone watching this can go and speak to this chatbot yourself now and just pretend you're a patient waiting in the emergency department waiting room. I just ask that you don't put any private information into there because it's not a secure platform and it's not good to put private medical information out over the internet like that. So basically, this is what the app looks like. It's deployed on BotPress, and it works in a simple question and answer format where the large language model has specific instructions given and written by myself, which tell it in what way to take a history, which is the same as saying do an interview. And it ultimately will come up with several ideas of its own as to what disease the patient is actually suffering from. But the goal is not to tell the patient what those diagnoses are. The goal is actually to produce a report which should be read by the doctors, which gives all the information the doctors would need in order to make the diagnosis, hopefully. The reason that therefore this is a neural network for disease detection is the large language model at the end of this interview about 90% of the time has a very concrete idea as to which diagnosis the patient has, which disease they're actually suffering from, and it uses that idea in order to formulate targeted follow-up questions which it uses to firm up or exclude that diagnosis. I think this is the superior approach because it's just not good to be told as a patient while you're in the waiting room of the hospital that you have a serious diagnosis like cancer. That's something that it's better to hear in conversation with the doctor or the nurses themselves. So this chatbot seeks to solve a problem we have in hospitals, which is that waiting times in waiting rooms are really, really long. A lot of times patients will sit for hours in the waiting room of the emergency departments before they're seen by a doctor. And then they have an interview with the doctor. And that interview is often short, in my opinion, often too short, because of the time pressures that doctors and other medical staff are put under. And then on the basis of that interview, a physical examination is then conducted. And tests are ordered, including blood tests and radiology. And we're using all of those elements, so the verbal history, the physical clinical examination, the blood tests, and then the radiology tests. The doctor attempts to come up with a diagnosis and then a management plan. So of all these elements, the history, the interview, so the verbal component, is, in my opinion, the most underutilized and neglected element of the patient's care. If the patient has come to the hospital 3 hours ago, then they've had 3 hours before being seen by the doctor in which they could be prompted to come up with responses to questions like, have you had these symptoms, or have you ever had this before, or can you tell us the last 5 times you came to hospital, the reason for that, what happened, where you were seen, what diagnosis you were given, and then what treatment you were provided. One of the problems is that when interviewing a patient, they feel like they're under a lot of pressure, and it's very difficult as a patient, especially as someone who's sick or old, to answer all the doctor's questions on the spot about your entire life and all the medical problems that you've had. So what this chatbot hopefully would do is use the enormous amount of time the patient has to take them step by step through their medical history in order to elicit the maximum possible amount of information from them. Sometimes people are forgetful about their medical history, and after interviewing them once, you'll come back later and then they'll say, "Doctor, I know you asked me about past medical conditions. I forgot to tell you I'm actually diabetic and I'm on insulin, but I told you earlier that I didn't take any regular medication." So there's also an element where, given a long period of time in which to take the interview, people naturally recollect things 10, 15, 30 minutes later that they couldn't produce on the spot. So in many ways, this chatbot would hopefully have superior performance to the doctor just because it's able to be with the patient for the full amount of time that they're in the hospital. So moving on to the code, this chatbot is built on OpenAI. It uses OpenAI's API. It's all hosted in the cloud on OpenAI's website at the standard base. Under the hood of OpenAI, which just, by the way, is written on top of PyTorch and largely in Python. So under the hood of OpenAI's API, it uses the ChatGPT-4 Turbo Large Language Model in order to give this assistant, as they call it, the ability to answer questions. And this assistant, which uses ChatGPT-4 in order to generate responses, I've also augmented with a file search function where I've uploaded about 2,000 pages of textbook, two textbooks in particular, which form the core of the Australian College of Emergency Medicine doctors' training curriculum for their trainee doctors. So these textbooks give a specific set of instructions to doctors, advising them to conduct an interview according to the following protocol, which is sort of goes through, like, you know, everything from the symptoms the patient currently has to a full exploration of their past medical history, and then what we call a social and occupational history, which is getting information about their living situation and what their level of functionality is like. These are the textbooks, and on the right hand side of the screen here is the history taking sequence that's recommended in this famous textbook, Tully and O'Connor's Clinical Examination. So it's starting with the presenting principal symptom, which is sort of like what's the main thing that's brought the patient in, and then it goes all the way down until it asks the doctor to conduct what you call a systems review, which is asking an enormous number of questions about other symptoms that might be occurring elsewhere in the body in completely separate biological systems. So even though the patient might have come in with a wound on their toe, taking a full history would involve also asking them, have you been having any chest pain recently, to screen for something like heart disease. So the PDFs in this section here are uploaded to a vector store on the OpenAI API, and then I give the assistant the vector ID so that it knows where to access those PDFs. And I specifically ask it in the instructions to refer to certain chapters or pages of those PDFs in order to teach it how to conduct certain parts of the interview. When designing the chatbot, I wanted to make it realistic. So in that sense, when a patient is in the waiting room of the emergency department, you don't really know whether they're going to be able to talk with this chatbot for 5 minutes or 5 hours. So I wanted to make the chatbot very flexible, such that if a patient really did only have 5 minutes, it can still produce the report that I'm seeking from it, which is the report that will ultimately be handed to the doctors. But if a patient also has 5 hours in which to type out responses to this chatbot, then the chatbot has the ability to adapt to that capability by the patient, so that it will continue asking lots and lots of questions and filling in the details of this history until it can produce an extremely detailed report, which I think the doctor would be happy to have, given that they probably don't have hours themselves to spend with the patient. And this ability to produce what I call a 2-stage report. So after 5 minutes of answering questions, or approximately 5 minutes, it'll produce a basic summary of why the patient has come in and the basic core information that the doctor would need in order to make a bare bones diagnosis and management plan. And then at that point, it'll say to the patient, so stage 1 is complete, thank you very much, like here's a report, it's going to be given to the doctors. And if you are willing to continue answering questions, so if you're willing to continue answering questions for the next 10 to 20 minutes, this chatbot will produce another more detailed report, which the doctor will appreciate. And so at that point, hopefully the patient, if they had the capability to do so, would say, yep, I'll keep answering questions. And then you can get into the very fine detail of their history. In the instructions, I ask it to present the final report in the same format as asked by Talia and O'Connor in the emergency medicine doctors training textbook. So in terms of using the API, it's using the OpenAI client, which requires a secret API key. I create an assistant called the Emergency Waiting Room Helper. I give it the instructions in text, which I've written above. The assistant is then created and it exists on the cloud at OpenAI. I then create a thread, which is a conversation with OpenAI. And here I actually don't yet define the assistant that I'm seeking to get responses from. But I've simulated here a patient or a user who says, I've come to the emergency department because I'm having stomach pain. From that point, a run is created, which is a sort of message and response of the system. And the first thing that the chatbot says is, I'm sorry to hear that you're experiencing stomach pain. Let's start off by gathering some basic information, better understand your situation. This will also help provide a concise summary for the doctors when you see them. And it asks a number of critical questions, like can you describe the stomach pain, when did it start, and any aggravating or relieving factors, as well as associated symptoms. So it's doing exactly what I've instructed it to do here, which is there are certain questions that it must ask, like what's happened that made you come to the emergency department and what are your symptoms. And I also allow it to ask 1 or 2 relevant follow-up questions after every necessary question that it asks. So it has some freedom to do its own thing. So it's asked these questions. I've then simulated a patient responding to its questions, and it said the pain is dull and achy. It began 4 hours ago. It's on the upper right side. Laying on my left side makes it better. I vomited about 12 times. And then the chatbot assistant comes back and says, I see it sounds quite uncomfortable for you. Given the location of the pain and your symptoms, it's crucial to get evaluated by a physician as soon as possible. Before we proceed, I've got a few more questions to help further specify your situation. And then it asks some relevant follow-up questions, which again generally follow the line of what I've asked it, but it's still not following exactly this order because it's able to ask questions that it thinks are necessary in between the questions that I've put to it there. And you can also see that it's retaining information as it runs. So this assistant can be retrieved via its assistant ID. These two don't match because I generated this one earlier, and then this is the current run on the Jupyter Notebook. But just with this assistant ID, you can use the OpenAI client to retrieve it. And then you can ask it a completely different question in a new thread, so a new conversation, like I have chest pain. and it will adapt to that new question and take a completely different history. As you can see here, the associated symptoms, shortness of breath, dizziness and sweating, are actually quite different to those asked for abdominal pain. So this chatbot has been deployed online. You can access it yourself. And in conclusion, I think that this is a good demonstration of how you can build a chatbot with relatively simple code, but with very complex instructions given to it. And on the basis of complex instructions, which here is multiple pages, and an extraordinary number of lines of things that it has to do, on the basis of those complex instructions, it can end up performing quite well, and it will generate a great report at the end. You can see that report, an example of one of those reports that's generated on the PowerPoint. Thank you so much. This is the end of my presentation, and it's been a pleasure being with you in this subject.